Good morning. It is 10 o'clock and we're starting on time. We are um, we're not in the studio today. We're in the offices for the student data privacy team. We have a very full agenda. Greg Cox is here. He is. We show him. Anyway, he's here in the background. We couldn't get that many people. Oh, Emily wants me to speak up a little. Okay, so I'll try to speak a little louder. Okay, thanks. I've added a few things to the agenda since the email that I sent out on Monday. We're going to talk about, let's see, this one.
Okay, pushing the arrow. Maybe.
Oh, okay. Here we go. We have a bunch of computer screens here. I think it thinks. No, that works. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about FERPA exceptions today. We're going to cover the 4 main exceptions of FERPA, and there's going to be a lot of words on the PowerPoint slides. David isn't a fan, but we try to highlight some of the main points within those words and a resource for you. We'll be talking about methods of sharing student data. We've gotten a lot of emails about this. We know that other departments within USBE have provided some information that's not 100% accurate, but nor 100% wrong. So kind of increasing the confusion, and we've spoken to those departments because we want a consistent message to LEAs. We also want to tell you about a letter that we're sending out to superintendents and charter school directors today that if you are the data manager, you will be copied into. We'll tell you about a small kind of intimate setting for a technical assistance. So we're not going to come with a PowerPoint. We're going Jared Hill, David, Greg, and myself will be there. Jared Hill's our IT security manager. We will be there to answer any questions that you have more about that. We'll talk about the Utah Data Privacy Conference and share with you some recent issues that you should be aware of and open it up for some Q&A. So let's start with some good news. David?
Sure. So the last couple of times we've had these webinars, I've reported on how many LEAs have completed at least one entry in their metadata dictionary. And as you can see, in August and September, those numbers were pretty low. We've got 154 LEAs, and last September we were only about 20. Funny thing is, when you send a letter out to every superintendent saying that it needs to be done, suddenly that number jumps up dramatically. So right now we're at about 110 have at least one entry. So we're really pleased with that. So that's the good news. And I don't know if this is bad news. Not so good news, let's say, is I took a look at some entries within the metadata dictionary, trying to get a feel for what has been entered. And in many cases, it's not exactly right, and we're hoping to do some more training. I'm actually going to talk about that, some of the exceptions right now, because that was one of the things I looked at. So it requires that you choose one of 4 exceptions, and one of them, for example, is audit evaluation. And I checked, and there's 214 entries that are audit evaluation right now in the dictionary, and of those, about 38% are actually just assessments. So like a bunch put in ACT for audit evaluation. And the thing is, that's not what this exception is about. That would probably be a school official exception. We'll go over what all of them are and hopefully give you a little more guidance here. Plus, we're planning on putting out in November video.
Maybe November and December.
November and December.
Because it's going to be, I think, a series of videos going over all of the exceptions. So there'll be multiple modules to a video. So maybe we'll have some out by November, but definitely by December, we'll be hitting on all 4 of these exceptions in detail. with a grade Cox prediction. So
Yes.
yes.
So we saw that and it's like, oh, okay, like I'm glad that we have at least one, but we're gonna have to go through and make sure like we're putting the actual correct exception. Another example would be directory information, which was very popular in some cases. I found one LEA that actually had a lot of entries, and more than half of them said directory information was the reason they were sharing. So then I went and looked and said, it was easy. I was able to go to their website and see what their directory information policy was, and it had a list of, well, here are the data elements we consider directory information.
Yeah.
Then I just went and saw, it's like, well, what you put in the metadata dictionary, are there any elements that aren't on your actual directory policy? And there were a large number. Here's just some that I found for just one district, including some things such as, the health screening information or information off their IEP that has no business being in a directory policy.
And we don't think, these aren't actually directory, like you said,
Yeah.
these are not actual data that the LEA is sending as part of the directory information.
Right.
Right.
I
So we
think
don't want to
yeah.
say that that's the case. It's the case that you're describing.
Yeah, and these are the kinds of things, as the auditor, I'll be able to look at more and just, look and see. It's like, well, if you say something's directory information, and you say in the metadata dictionary that you're sharing this as directory information, does it line up? And clearly, like, there's a disconnect somewhere. And so one of the first things we wanted to do today was talk in more detail about what the 4 big exceptions are, not just for the sake of metadata dictionary, though we do want that to be accurate. We hope to move away from the point where our main metric is, do you have at least one entry, to do you have all of your entries? And are they correct? Are they accurate? So what we wanted to do is quickly go over the 4 main exceptions and pull out some of the actual language from FERPA, as well as I believe we have a video going to show about what directory information is. Since
we hope.
Yeah, that's
we
one of the.
We might need Emily to come and help us.
We'll see how that goes. But that is, again, that's one of the more common. I would think, just if I were to look at them all, directory information and school official would probably be your 2 most common ones. Studies would then come third, and audit or evaluation would actually be one that I would think would get used fairly rarely. So what do you want to...
What I want to say about this is that it's hard to remember the nuances to all of these exceptions. And after being in this world for a bit of time, the only document that I have printed and put on my office wall is this document here. I think I can bring this guy over, I'm hoping. Are you able to see that? That's why I thought it.
No,
oh,
there it is.
good,
It just
good.
takes a second.
And I provided the link. Again, as always, this is being recorded and the slides will be made available. We do that with, within a few days typically. But this is the document that I have. It's 11 by 17, so it's kind of a big guy, and it's, with PTAC. And this is a summary of FERPA exceptions. And I go to this at least every week, and I keep giving this away. But this goes through directory, school official studies, audit and evaluation, and you're going to notice a lot of copying and pasting from this document into the slides today. But we're going to highlight a few of the sections that are really most important for you to understand. So all conditions that must be met, legal reference, and how it needs to be recorded, and that's it, a one-pager on this. So I suggest that all of you go to this, print it out, put it on your wall, and know that we are constantly going to this document as well for clarity. To get back to here, unless you have one of these exceptions, you need parental consent.
Well, there's actually a couple of other minor exceptions.
That's true. That's true. I'm sorry. Yeah. There are a few other very specific things that require you to disclose without parental consent, such as a subpoena, There's information for the juvenile justice system,
Financial aid.
financial aid. So no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
These are the four main ones. Other ones, oftentimes they're pretty specific, and we can answer those questions for you. So here we are. We're starting with directory information, and for this, instead of reading you, let's see if I can. I think this will go there. I'm going to show you a quick video that's just on directory information. It's only, I think, 2.5 minutes long, but it's better than listening to me just read through this. Okay, sorry, it's taking a moment. It's over here. Again, this is PTAC. You can see it?
Yeah, click on it and then excellent.
Mary Smith just made the honor roll. Can her school share the good news? Under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, kindergarten through 12th grade parents or eligible students 18 or older generally must provide consent before public schools and districts can share personally identifiable information from students' education records. One of the exceptions to this rule is for the disclosure of properly designated directory information. Schools and districts can designate certain basic student information as directory information and share that information without consent if certain additional requirements are met. Why would schools and districts want to use directory information? Because they want to include information about students in certain publications, such as student directories, annual yearbooks, honor rolls, graduation programs, playbills for theater productions, or sport programs. Schools and districts may also want to provide directory information to outside organizations that provide services for students, such as companies that manufacture glass rings, take student photos, or publish yearbooks. So how can this be done? Under FERPA, before sharing directory information, a school or district must first identify the student's personally identifiable information considered to be directory information, such as the student's name, address, telephone listing, email address, photograph, date and place of birth, grade level, participation in officially recognized activities and sports, the weight and height of members of athletic teams, and degrees, honors, and awards received by the student. It is important to note that information contained in an education record that would generally be considered harmful or an invasion of privacy if disclosed, such as social security numbers, can never be considered directory information. Next, the school or district must give public notice of the items designated as directory information, the right of parents and eligible students to opt out of letting their personal information be disclosed as directory information, and the deadline by which they must opt out in writing. What else should we know about directory information? FERPA allows schools and districts to adopt a limited directory information policy. It's okay for a school or district to decide that it wants to disclose directory information for specific purposes and/or to specific parties. For example, a district could decide to disclose directory information in a parent directory, but not to disclose that same information to companies that want to market products to the students and their parents. Under this policy, the district's directory information notice should specify the parties that may receive directory information and/or specify the purposes for which the information may be shared. Also, under the directory information exception, disclosures do not need to be recorded as they do under other FERPA exceptions. For additional information about FERPA and directory information, including a model notification, please visit the U.S. Department of Education's Privacy Technical Assistance Center at ptac.ed.gov and the Family Policy Compliance Office at familypolicy.ed.gov.
Okay, minimize it. There we are.
Video.
Okay, so I thought that would be a little more fun to watch than me talking about this, but at the very end they said that the information disclosed did not need to be recorded, and FERPA, for FERPA that is true, but that is not the case in Utah because of the Student Data Protection Act. It does not distinguish between directory information and how other data are disclosed. And so you do need to include that in the metadata dictionary. So just, but everything else in there was in line with our state law. David, do you want to talk about this one or the audit one?
I'll talk about school official, but also kind of segue from talking about directory information, because it seems like, especially in the metadata dictionary, a lot of the entries are educational apps, let's say. And those ones, like, you could use the directory information exception, but you probably don't want to. And the reason being is that opt-out, that parents can opt out of directory information. That's why it's probably the one you're going to use the most for things like the yearbook, for playbills, for sports programs or whatnot. You know, things where it's like, we're going to be sharing this with the public. If you're sharing it with a particular vendor, school official makes more sense. Also because, you know, if the parent opts their kid out, they won't appear in the yearbook, but then they also couldn't use, you know, whatever app you're using in the class. And so for those reasons, I would say that's probably more of a school official. School official means, you know, someone who works at the school, right? So it includes a teacher, principal, and you're allowed to share with information about students within the school in order for people to do their jobs. And one of the points that Greg and I like to make, though, is just because you can share something doesn't mean you should, right? It's that idea of legitimate educational interest. If you're just sitting around the water cooler in the teacher's lounge and you're gossiping about students, that's probably not a legitimate educational interest. But it also allows you to outsource to individuals who don't work at the school, but who you would otherwise use employees for. And that's generally where you're going to actually list the school official in, say, the metadata dictionary. You don't need to list that you will share data with teachers at your school.
Yeah.
So this is the one I would think for a lot of those educational apps or websites, you would want to say the school official exception. Now, one of the things that comes up with that, though, is that's different from directory information. With directory information, you kind of can't control what happens with it, right? If you make a playbill, you make a yearbook, that information is out there. It's public. You can't stop people from doing stuff with it. With school official, you should have what FERPA calls direct control regarding the maintenance and use of those records. And I think, again, this is important because, like, if you are sharing student data with an app or website, you need to have control over that. You need to be able to tell that website or whoever, whatever company it is, you know, that you need to delete certain records. Or you should be able to have the right to be able to audit or know what is going on with their records, what they're doing with them, which you would not need that for directory information. Directory information is, look, we put on a play, you know, we wanted to let you know who the kids are who are in it.
They can redisclose it
Yeah.
to anything. They can redisclose it to the
Exactly.
newspaper.
But with websites, you want to be so much more careful with that. You don't want to give them that right, because that's the third part of school official is there's restrictions regarding redisclosure. You don't want a website redisclosing that information and selling it. Or using it for targeted advertising, which under the Student Data Protection Act, they're not allowed to do. So when I was looking at the metadata dictionary and seeing several what I knew were websites or vendors with the directory information exception, it made me think, that's probably not the right one. There's a lot of reasons you want to choose school official for that and not directory information. And then that fourth idea, again, is that legitimate educational interest. So school official is, again, more restrictive. You know, you can use a yearbook for, you know, photos, whatever. You couldn't control someone from not doing it.
Sorry, that was
but definitely, like, if it's a website and they're providing an educational service, you want to be able to have a little bit more control over what they do with it and why they have it. So there was a question from Casey. A school sent a note home to parents saying if the parents do not respond, then they consent to their child's photo being placed on the school homepage. I said that the school would need to have a signed paper of the parents' consent to be accurate. Am I wrong or are they wrong? I'm going to go with that you're wrong.
Yeah.
It is an opt-out. not an opt-in. So if you are sharing that information using the directory information exception, which is generally if it's publicly showing pictures of some sort, then parents have the right to opt out of that. It is not collect an opt-in from every parent to make sure it's okay.
And this is kind of, this rule or this way of doing things is kind of the least restrictive. It doesn't prohibit, FERPA says that this is the bare minimum standard, right? This is the most permissive that you can be in disclosing data. So it doesn't prohibit states or educational entities or schools to make the decision to be more restrictive. You cannot be more permissive than FERPA. You can only be more restrictive.
Yep.
So if your policy, because of your community, is that they would like to have the policy be that they need to have a signed consent from all the parents in order to use photographs, it's fine. You can do that. But as far as FERPA and our state laws are concerned, you're wrong, I guess.
Well, you're wrong from FERPA doesn't
Exactly.
say that.
Exactly.
So if you're saying that's
Exactly.
according to FERPA, that is incorrect. If you want to make a more restrictive policy that made it an opt-in and you want to track that, you are more than welcome to. And so your follow-up question, if a parent does not want their child on the homepage, that parent would need to notify school officials. And that is correct, again, within FERPA. Again, unless you want to make it more restrictive. FERPA does indicate that you have to annually notify, if we're going back to directory information, you have to annually notify parents of what your directory information policy is. And the video lets you know that you could, you can put even more restrictions on yourself if you want, saying, we will only use it for these purposes or only share it with these people. But again, you don't have to. But the idea would be you would have to annually notify. Generally, this will be on your website somewhere. I would also recommend that you send it home with like the first day of school papers so that parents see it and that they have and you need to give them a timeline. You need to say, I mean, I've seen some schools where it's as little as 10 days to opt out. Again, that's up to you. FERPA doesn't say what the timeline needs to be. I would think just to be able to function as a school, it probably works better if it's a shorter time period. So if you want to just leave it open, the trick is if there is an opt-out, you have to keep track of it and you have to make sure that it is not disclosed against the parents' wishes. And so that's why I think, again, having a short time period is probably the best policy, but again, however you want to do it.
And I'm, that doesn't mean that, if a parent comes and said, I would like to opt out of this, and it's January, you certainly, the parent has the right to opt out of it at any time. It's just that you won't be out of compliance if after that time period you said you have been disclosing the student directory information in, October and November, but the parent always has control over that. So, as new students come in or they'll have that time period, but we know that most LEAs would obviously follow what the parent, they have to follow what the parent decides on that. So moving on to the next exception. This is a studies exception, and David and I focus on this one phrase that the disclosure of PII for the purposes of conducting studies needs to be for or on behalf of you, the educational entity, or for us at the state. It is not for university professors to publish articles, or it can be that's permitted. But again, you, the LEA and the SEA, have control over the studies, and it needs to be on your behalf. And so there's a few reasons to do this: develop, validate, administer predictive tests, student aid programs. We mentioned that before. I had a question actually last week that you're able to disclose this information once a student has applied for receiving student aid, not before. I think there's it was just last week where a university sent out an email to a number of superintendents saying, okay, please provide the students that have a particular ACT score range and their ethnicity and their name and contact information. Do not disclose that information. It was for a scholarship opportunity. If they have already received that scholarship opportunity and you're notified of that, you can share the pertinent information, but not before the scholarship has been offered. And the other kind of the larger, or I guess the more used reason is to improve instruction. And again, it needs to be for or on behalf of the educational entity. So again, you can see a few other exceptions or a few other conditions here. But at the very bottom, there's the recordation requirements that you need to record all disclosures of PII for the purposes of, again, school official studies and also audit and evaluation. And this is kind of reaffirmed in the Student Data Protection Act with using the metadata dictionary. So it needs to be documented. Let's see, I think that's all for the studies. Oh, yep. Here we are. So speaking of the Student Data Protection Act, it kind of puts other requirements in place that really FERPA alludes to anyway. This just makes it a little more clear that an LEA, you need to have a research review process, and some of the LEAs are very, very small, but I suggest that you not have one person making those decisions. Right. I mean, that's just
that's bad accountability.
That it really is, that you at least have a committee, and a lot of these processes should include stakeholder feedback on how they should be approved. You can see here that, you know, a student data manager, and many of you are, you can share some data, but that last bit in red, that you cannot share personally identifiable student data for the purposes of external research and evaluation. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know whether it's good or bad, but there isn't a definition of what external means. External at the state, I'll tell you how we defined it. This actually might be something that may be clarified more in legislation in this next legislative session. But external does not mean USBE. We are one and the same. External does not mean you know, reporting on federal reporting requirements. When there is money attached, when there's money received to either the state or to the LEAs, there are strings attached, and some of those you need to be very aware of. But there are this was put in place. I think David did a little bit of digging around of why this was included. So do you want to describe that?
I mean, basically, the practice we're trying to avoid is having like a professor or a private company call you up and say, hey, could we just get some student data? We want to like do a study of some sort, and you just saying sure and giving it to them. I mean, so that's why it was included in the Student Data Protection Act. But it's still, if you think about it, it's consistent with what FERPA said, that idea of for or on your behalf for an educational purpose. So that's kind of how we've been defining it within our own agency. You know, if I think an example is great schools came to us and said, can you just give us a whole bunch of data so like we can, you know, better rank schools in our system and it'll affect real estate prices. And we said, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want you making money off of our data. If, however, like we wanted to have a study done about the efficacy of Utah Compose or some system that we are paying for that is not federally or state required, then what we would do is we could contact a researcher could contact us. Either way, we have an external research review process where we go over those requests and decide whether we want that done for and on our behalf.
And so we have direct control. Again, there's a consistent theme with directory information, school officials, studies, and audit and evaluation. Well, audit and evaluation, you sometimes we're required to. But when there is a decision that needs to be made, like what software to use or whether to participate in a particular study, the thing that I always think of is direct control. That the LEA and the state, we are ultimately responsible for the data. The vendors are not. I always use the metaphor of babysitting, right? We are, some of us have children, some of us get babysitters because we need a little bit of a break. But we set the rules of what the babysitter can do with our children. Children must go to bed by 9, do their homework. You can't, take them to, what was it, Nightmare on 13th and scare them for... But the idea is having control over what is done. You should take it very seriously and think through, do you have control? Or are you just giving the data away and not maintaining that control? I think we have some chatter, some notes here. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so one was the question, so what about if there's parental consent for the study? And again, that we're talking about cases where you can share data without prior parental consent. Parental consent is always a golden ticket. If the parent consents, then you can share for the purposes of a study. And honestly, even though this FERPA exception allows you to share it for a study, like we said, this is the minimal level of scrutiny. You're always welcome to, and I think it's generally even a good idea, depending on what the study is, to get that parental consent anyway. And then the other question was, so B down there where it's talking about for external research or evaluation, National Clearinghouse, which I believe is the feds.
I don't know enough about it. We'd have to look into that. Is it a federal requirement to participate? It may be.
Yeah, and if that's the case,
question.
it wouldn't be the studies exception, because there's a different one for if you're required to federally.
That's probably an audit or evaluation, which actually we're talking about next.
This is our next one.
This is our last one. There are a number of slides on this, and I apologize, they're very, very wordy, but I wanted you to have the slides on hand. But then again, I can't make it more, can't tell you how important it is to print off that studies exception PTAC and have that near you. We look to it all the time to remind us of these requirements. But the audit and evaluation exception, it needs to be a state or federally supported education program. That's kind of where I say where there's money attached. Sometimes there are strings attached to that. And you can see here that sometimes an audit or evaluation is done by a particular state or federal agency, but oftentimes it is contracted out to others to perform those evaluations. I know here at USBE, we have an external evaluator for some of our assessments, and there are contracts. Let me go on to the next one. You can see there that there must be a written agreement. You don't just say, okay, this is for an evaluation or an audit of a program. There's an agreement that says, again, here's the control idea. You can do this with the data. You must protect it and destroy it when done. And you need to use very reasonable best practices for protecting the data and destroying it, and not, let me go on to the next slide, and not redisclose the data unless it is for a particular exception. Let's say you give the data to a vendor and there's a subpoena for that data. So that exception would apply, but there is no other way that can be redisclosed. Also, they cannot use it for other purposes. I guess that was in the last slide. you determine, or there's an agreed upon purpose for the data. And then again, we also see that you need to record all disclosures. And this is where the metadata dictionary comes in pretty handy, that you can record all of this within the metadata dictionary and track it. I would also suggest having your own tracking system for these disclosures. I know that we have that here. David, as he was looking at the metadata dictionary recently, he noticed that LEAs cited a few, I guess we have a state statute and a board rule that explains why an audit is being performed at the LEA level. And so we wanted to share that with you as you're working on the metadata dictionary. And these are hyperlinks, so you can click to that and find out a little bit more.
Right. And again, the idea is, if we haven't already hit on it enough, auditor evaluation you use only if it is a federal or state program. Now that might mean that you are required to have an audit, and like these particular statutes and board rule explain the internal audits that you are supposed to have as an LEA. And I noticed that some LEAs included these already in their metadata dictionary, so they said, you know, which company they send data to for the purpose of internal audit, or I guess an external audit is what it would be in those cases. This isn't to say it's only for this, but I think, again, that's really the big key is federal or state program. Federal or state programs might mandate that you have an audit or evaluation of the data. It doesn't have to be mandated. So if, for whatever reason, there's a state program or federal program and you want to have your data audited, that feels a little bit more like, to me at least, the kind of thing USBE would do. Like we have researchers that we send SAGE data to in order to audit it so that we can present information to our board. That's why I think this one probably isn't going to be used a lot in the metadata dictionary for LEAs. I think there are cases where I'm probably wrong, but it strikes me that most of your data is probably going out for one of the other three reasons. Certainly, like if there's a local program and you want to know more of how it's doing, you would have to use the studies exception, because this is only for a federal or state program that you would use this.
Exactly.
So again, we don't really explain these exceptions in the metadata dictionary data entry tutorial.
Well, no, you don't.
Not to this degree we just did.
We do have within the metadata dictionary a question mark next to the exceptions field that actually pops up exactly verbatim this FERPA exception sheet by PTAC. But go on.
Yeah. But what's more the point is, if this is your first time hearing about the metadata dictionary, if you're one of the, let's see, we have 110 out of 154.
Yeah.
So if you're one of the 44 that hasn't entered anything in yet, this video is a good place to start. Shows you how to get there, shows you step by step how to enter your data. It's what, 8 minutes? Yeah.
8 minutes. It's very funny. We've gotten a lot of, you don't think we can make this fun, but challenge accepted.
Yeah. But also, please contact me with any questions that you have. We are hoping to put in some upgrades to make it a little bit easier to use.
That's moving along. We're meeting about that
tomorrow.
It's been a few months. We haven't upgraded it at all, but so to make it a little more user friendly, I think, for example, there with the justification for disclosing data, we have these 4 exceptions, but we failed to put in the exception for that there's parental consent. Oops. And so, which we hadn't really considered. So, so there's kind of little tweaks here and there, but it's not going to be a major rehaul. What you see is what you get at this point in time. It's very functional. Watch the tutorial. Contact David. And if you have any suggestions on how to improve it, we're all ears. We are not using it as much as you are, I think. And so,
yeah.
What else do we have next? Oh, geez. this topic.
Sure. Okay. So something that comes up is, okay, so we've decided that we can share data with a school official or with a parent. You can always share it with a parent, right? The question has come up with, which is, well, what is the best way for us to do it? And this becomes much more of a security question than a privacy question. You've got the okay, FERPA allows you to do it, but what is the best method for doing it? And then one of the issues is, it's never 100%. There's never anything that is 100% secure. You can't buy it off the shelf. It doesn't, you're not going to get a perfect solution in a box, no matter what the vendor selling it tells you. And this isn't just an exercise in training or whatever. It's not a thing you can just put on autopilot, just train them once and be done. Like this is honestly, I think, one of the areas where, you're going to get breaches it's when you're actually sending the data. Are you doing it the safest way, the best way to do it? FERPA and even Student Data Protection Act offer very little guidance on this. FERPA basically just says you need to use reasonable best practices, which, if you think about it, is good. You wouldn't want it written down what the reasonable best practice is, because we need to be flexible. Reasonable best practices are going to change.
Yeah.
We've been trying to write up documentation to give you guidance on how to do this. And it is really, really hard.
It's hard.
Because it depends on, honestly, things like the size of your school. It depends on your population. It depends on what exception you're using.
Your email service.
Yeah, it depends, on so many different things that it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all, but that's what we're trying to do because we want to make it simple for you. We also are aware, if we haven't, I believe we already mentioned, that there are some departments with USBE that have already kind of written up their own policies for what they think you should be doing. And I think this is problematic. We can dictate how we want you to communicate with us, but we can't dictate what your internal policies should be. Mm-hmm. There's nothing in board rule that gives us that right. So let's move on to the next slide and see basically what we have. So really, it's an exercise in determining risk. And even like the best guidance we've gotten from PTAC is, you need to understand what your data are, how they could be used. And it's hard because even like, I think some things that would be considered harmless under directory information, a student's name, a name could be used to threaten a person a lot more easily than maybe their ACT score, which we would probably think would be a lot more protected. And so, again, therein it gets hard, right, to say that a student's name is always okay to share, even under the directory exception. What if that student's name, what if that student is a foster child and, we want to have extra protections for the kid?
I think it goes to this point is what we've talked about. We've tried to talk about this, and it's really hard because the documentation we've been looking at putting together, we'll put something together, and it often is, well, that would work, but you would have to have these perfect conditions put in place. But I guess it's the idea that there needs to be a cultural shift that that less is more when sending. Send the very bare minimum of one thing we can say, that training and awareness is really the best bang for the buck. And we just gave training to all of USBE staff in August, and we can't just be one and done. I think after the training, some folks kind of overgeneralized and didn't want to send anything. And that, we still need to function. We still need to disclose information to get work done. But I think it's looking at using a little bit of extra time and awareness of what you're sending. For example, if you just need to send information about one student, why not a phone call? Why don't you make a phone call? Or do you really need to include all of the information that you're sending? And as David described it, it oftentimes can depend on the size of your LEA, because what many of us aren't aware of is email is not secure.
And that's the big thing is, and that we've become so used to it. It's our culture, right? That culture of security, just sending whatever in an email. And what we're again advocating for, I think, is, stopping and thinking about it before you send it. Like Whitney was saying, it's like, do they need all this information? What is the least amount of information I can send this person to get the job done? And even then, and it becomes hard because some email is encrypted. And if it's internal, if you're sending it to another teacher, it's encrypted from end to end. That's generally considered safe. So it's very, very complicated.
One thing that I can say is we have heard that entire student records, when students transferred, are being sent through email and also through a fax machine, through faxes. So you have student information, sometimes very, very sensitive. And, oftentimes we think that, well, I don't care if people know my kids' names or their scores or their, what teachers they had, or, we're not concerned about that. And I can say that's probably true for a lot of people. But it doesn't matter. You don't know that 1 or 2 or 3 out of 100 students where this is going to be extremely detrimental to their lives, or even put their lives kind of on the line or at risk. It's something we don't like to think about, but you need to, just because you even know the student, you don't know everything about them. You don't know their circumstance. You don't know their complete history, and it's none of your business. The idea is you need to treat all of the student data with protection, and just think of kind of a worst case scenario. So how should you transfer student records? You should do it through a secure email service. We use Move It at the state. There are a number of them out there. It is your responsibility to teach those that they need to send this. I mean, because right now we're talking about maybe one-off emails.
Mm-hmm.
I need help merging these SSIDs, or this student needs help with their homework, or sending it out to parents. But when you're sending entire student records, please make those changes in your practice. Again, training and awareness. Do you really need to provide all of that information? Even if you think you're not providing much, we know your name. You'll use usually a gender pronoun, a he or she. We know what school districts is coming from the email. So things can get very, very personally identifiable, and email is not a secure way of sending data. What PTAC says about sending data is pretty vague as well. But consider the sensitivity level. Again, we look at the risk before you're sending this over email. Again, this is not necessarily a data privacy concern, because we're not talking about whether it is acceptable to disclose the data. We're assuming that the disclosure to the parent or to USBE or to others is meeting one of those conditions that we've described. But this is kind of the method. And like David mentioned, we keep it very, very, FERPA keeps this very vague on how to send this. But you can see here that sending a paper copy or via a secure carrier is a great way to desensitize data before sending that. Just taking the extra steps to ensure that really, if there is a disclosure, a breach of these data, that you can show that you were using best practices and kind of going the extra mile, because like we said, there is no 100% secure way, unfortunately.
Yeah. But with that, I also want to say, with any of these security questions, again, like the minimal standard is reasonable best practice. And therein is where we become concerned, where it's like, if it is, what is reasonable, right? And especially since there is no board rule or legislation that defines that for you, it has to be defined at a local level and kind of deal with what your individual risk appetite might be as a district. Again, this is the kind of thing I would recommend, not just one person deciding, having whatever group is dictated within your data governance plan to make these kinds of decisions, get stakeholder input, get parent input. You know, I mean, like a simple example, also with security, but not related to sending PII, is the idea of phishing emails. What is reasonable? Am I supposed to now spend like 5 minutes looking over every single detail on the email or every email I get just to see on the off chance that it is a phishing email? And that sounds unreasonable to me, to spend 5 minutes on each email.
Well, especially if it's not asking you for any information.
Exactly. But it's more like we're saying, a lot of it is that training and just becoming aware of when things seem a little bit off.
At the recent SaintCon conference that we went to a few weeks ago, we talked to some experts in the field. A lot of them, kind of hired hackers, the good hackers, and I said, well, this seems like it's a really, really difficult task. And they said, I asked, what would you recommend? And they said, do not be the lowest hanging fruit to these hackers. And one way to do that is to provide these trainings to the teachers. A few months ago at this point in time, we had 4 teachers from a district that will remain unnamed that accidentally disclosed a lot of information that they should have. And it was simply because they were very sloppy in sending an email. And so they had not been trained on this yet. And believe me, they have been trained now. And all of the parents were contacted with the disclosure because that is required with the data breach. So you don't want to find yourself, because we have to tell you, we hear about data breaches more often than I'd like to, but less often than they're actually occurring. And you want to be able to stand up and say, we have put forth our best effort. And guess what? Those of you that are putting forth this effort, I would say they receive a lot fewer problems. I mean, it's never 100%, but you definitely reduce your odds. And we want your odds to always be in your favor.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that, though, again, so I guess those are kind of the two key things I would take away from that is you need to determine the sensitivity of certain data. And like an example I like to give with that is, if it's directory information that we're emailing to the Deseret News, a list of student athletes who are going to be participating in a tournament, and they're going to turn around and they're going to publish that in their newspaper. How sensitive is that really? Like how many extra methods should I be sending that end-to-end encrypted? And
the parent has it opted out. The parent has it opted out.
And all those things where it's like, I mean, it's going to become public in a second anyway. Like, do I really need to use like high-level security measures for that? Probably not. So there again is why I think that's the first thing is, consider the sensitivity level of the data. Consider the sensitivity level within context. That's one of the things Whitney was kind of hitting at. A student's name on its own is probably directory information and fine. But when you start putting other things like their special ed status on there, suddenly now like this isn't quite as good of a thing. We shouldn't be sending this without higher security measures.
Casey just asked a question that I think we can point to the security video that we have. We put together. I have very little. Thanks, guys. We have Greg and David put together this fantastic video. It's 12 minutes long. It's located on our website under LEA, isn't it?
Probably.
Resources.
Training resources. Training resources.
Thank you. I feel that paranoia that you're talking about. Anyway, I definitely do things differently because of that video, and I think that the paranoia is real and it's founded to some degree, but also we're just looking at kind of as long as you're not the lowest hanging fruit is what they say, right?
Right, and I think also, I think it's really worth talking with the people back at your LEA, the decision makers, your principals, school directors, board, whomever, letting them know the threats to education data. Like it's been in the news. I don't know if people have heard of the dark overlord attacks, where it's a person or group going by the name Dark Overlord who has hacked into various school systems, gotten a lot of student data, and used it to send threatening emails and text messages to parents about how they are going to murder their students, and giving like lots of personal information about them to let them know that they are serious.
Maybe we'll find that. Could you find that article, Greg, and put it in the chat?
And then there's even, just like if there is a kid at your school who happens to be really good with computers, they can hack into your system. They can, for fun, they can alter grades or records. They can use it to get revenge on teachers and faculty and other students.
Things are getting really mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there are nation state actors. There's, just hackers in other countries that are just trying to get into the system to, make money, right, or to commit fraud or all kinds of things. I think it is good to let them know, what the threats are, and then let them know, look, like there's some low-hanging fruit we can do. Like if we just change, how we share data, what our email policy is, it's going to make us that more secure, because the chances are, like, and we've said this in our trainings, 95% of the data that is going to be breached is because of human error. It's not going to be because of your security system. That's why training is so much bang for your buck. And so again, like regarding training, like we already have some resources. Greg can probably point you in the direction of more, but that's the path I think I would go.
I think I would also kind of spin this, because we kind of look, we don't want fear to be the number one driving force in getting things done, but it certainly is a very motivating force. I think also spinning this as a way to be a leader, and one way to do that is going through the COSIN Trusted Learning Environment kind of certification. And will you provide that link to them, David? And, it costs a couple $100, but it's an application that you fill out, and what it does is it takes the COSIN will, after looking at all of the evidence that you provide to them, will identify you as a trusted learning environment. And it's called a CTL, right? Or TLE, that's what it is, TLE. And this is something that you can use to market to your community, that you, to build public trust. We've lost a lot of public trust. And this is that's one of the ways you can build public trust. And so it's not just out of fear, but it's also one way for you to kind of highlight yourself and show off. So moving on, because we're almost out of time, we wanted to tell you about a letter that we're about to send out. This first letter on the left was one that we sent to all superintendents and charter school directors on, I think it was August 31st. We told them about the requirements that were due October 1st. It is now November 1st. Welcome to November. We are sending out a letter to the right. It looks very much the same. That's on purpose. We want them to remind them of the requirement. And then in that status box, that status column, we're going to put what we have found. So we've collected all of this. We've given them time. We've been reviewing them. And now we're going to let them know what their status is and continue to provide assistance in having everyone, all LEAs be compliant. Also, one thing that we are offering that I talked about at the agenda was kind of more individualized technical assistance, where we're not going to have a PowerPoint ready. We're just going to sit in Basement West. And if you don't come, we'll have a lovely chat amongst ourselves. But if you do come, we're going to be totally at your disposal to help you through all of these topics: data governance plans, IT security plans, because Jared Hill will be there, training materials, metadata dictionary entries, and anything data privacy related. You don't need an appointment. You don't need to be there the entire time. Just come in and out as you please. We're going to set up a number of these events in the spring as well that are a little more specifically targeted. But for now, we wanted to at least provide a little bit of time. Of course, we're always available to answer emails, phone calls, even come to your LEA and have these discussions. But we wanted to set aside a time for you to come. We've kind of beat this topic. We've been talking about this a lot lately, the Utah Data Privacy Conference. We're so excited for it. Things are coming together. Things are ready to go. But we want to let you know that please do not come to the conference unless you register. We've heard that some people said, oh, yes, I'll be there. And I say, well, have you registered? And they, no, I haven't registered. There are kind of room capacities that we're working with, in particular for the Salt Lake City location. We do have rooms still in the Cedar City, but Salt Lake, we're about 98% full. And we want to make sure that everyone who is coming has been registered. So there's the link to register. We will be closing registration for that today at 5 o'clock. The Cedar City one will remain open until full, or November 8th at 5 o'clock. So that's next Wednesday. Just to give you a taste of the agenda, we'll be having a keynote speaker, and then there'll be a number of breakout sessions. Folks are flying in from DC, Connecticut, Colorado, and all the way up Ogden. They're coming all the way from Ogden, and and Jordan. We have a few.
West Jordan.
So what we had here is really a good mix of kind of federal folks, so they can speak to FERPA. We have PTAC coming out. We have our guys Barron and Ross. So this is just the first half of the day. And this is the Salt Lake version. The Cedar City one is almost exactly the same, except for a couple of folks, but the sessions within will remain the same. It's almost all the same. And here's the second half. So we have folks talking about security and privacy from both the federal and the state level. David?
Yeah, and so you'll see that one toward the bottom at 3. Greg and I will be giving the state of the state, and so we'll be going over some of the data that we have so far on what's kind of going on in the state. And one of the things we'll be doing is distributing a survey, hopefully today, maybe tomorrow at the latest. We'll be emailing all of the data managers. So this is our data manager survey. We have some questions. We want to kind of get a sense of what's going on. And so that will go out, like I said, either today or tomorrow, depending on how long it takes us to email them out to everyone. Please respond to us. I tried to write it so that it would be probably not take more than 10, 15 minutes.
10 minutes. I think it's 10 minutes.
Probably at this point, yeah. There's a couple open-ended ones where, like, if you want the extra 5 minutes to take it to 15, you're more than welcome to. We're just trying to get a pulse, a sense of what is going on where you are. And this, we thought, would be a quick way to get that information. And we will be presenting on what we find, as well as a couple other things during the 30-minute session there.
Yeah. Also, we don't really have time for Q&A today, but you can always call or email us. I just wanted to make you aware of a few kind of larger issues that you should be aware of. These are hyperlinks that you can click on. There were significant changes to the juvenile justice amendments, which decriminalized a few minor offenses. Forgive me if I don't use the right terms here, but things like truancy or like smoking behind the gym. Some of these lesser offenses they used to be kind of more, they're criminalized, and so the student would go through the juvenile justice system. But instead of that, this new change offers a number of programs that an LEA can refer the student to participate in if they have these truancy or these or smoking behind the gym. I don't know exactly where the line is, But what you need to be aware of is that when someone is in the juvenile justice system, that both FERPA and our Student Data Protection Act, that the LEA is permitted to disclose, is required oftentimes to disclose information about that student. A referral for a student to participate in a program is not the same as a student receiving services from the juvenile justice system. So that means just because a student has been referred, you do not disclose any information about that student unless a parent has consented to that student participating in that program. Now, all your LEAs have different policies on discipline of these students. So you'll need to look at those policies, but essentially you need to know that disclosure to these programs is not permitted. Do not disclose the information about the student unless you receive parental consent. Some of your policies might say that the student needs to participate in a particular program or be expelled. So it seems that they would likely participate in the program, but until a parent or the guardian has accepted those services, do not disclose information. The other larger issue you want me to be aware of is the Utah Data Research Center. This is something that's not totally functional yet, but that will be an issue, a system more at the state level that this was the statewide longitudinal data system. They call it SLDS in other states, but not so much in Utah. This was housed at USBE. It's now moved to the Division of Workforce Services, and some of the management of this research center has significantly changed. I don't want to speak too much more about that until the data governance has been figured out there. Also, I've been asked about the suicide prevention programs. In the last legislative session, there was a new, there was, because of the suicide rates in Utah, someone was hired to be an autopsy, I'm going to use the wrong term, but someone to investigate kind of the reasons behind suicides of students in Utah. And I wanted you to be aware that that is the case. That there is, how do we say this? When a student has died, whether it be from suicide or any other act, they're no longer receiving funds, and they're no longer considered students, and so their FERPA does not apply. So student records legally can be freely disclosed as and that's kind of the bare minimum of what FERPA says. So you wouldn't be breaking the law by disclosing information of deceased students, but that's not really what we would consider to be sensitive or best practice. And so even in those cases, work with your school counselors, with state folks to really consider the sensitivity of the situation. But we were asked kind of legally, is it permissible to disclose? And the answer is yes, you can disclose student personally identifiable information if the student is deceased. That doesn't mean that you have to or that you should, it just means it is permissible. So we'll end on that happy note. And again, the conference registration will close at 5 o'clock today, so for Salt Lake. So if you want to come, please do. If you are closer or kind of the same distance from Cedar City to Salt Lake, I would recommend the Cedar City location for two reasons. It'll be the second go around, and it'll be a smaller setting, so you'll be able to get more personalized attention. So
And there'll be more parking.
Oh, there'll be more parking as well.
A lot of parking downtown.
So thank you for being patient and letting us go a little over time, and have a great day.